Well, welcome to another It's Not About Me podcast. My name is Greg Valoria, aka Social Greg on Twitter, with my co-host.
I'm Tripp Braden with Tripp Braden at Empowering Serving Leaders, and we talk a lot about partnerships.
That's cool. So, and that's good you said partnerships, because that's what we're going to be talking about in the next 2 or 3 maybe episodes of this podcast, where we're going to talk about partnerships and social enterprises, whether they're nonprofits or for-profits that kind of want to help society, but also they need partnerships and sponsorships to run, open the doors, as we were just talking about earlier offline. So what we want to do is really kind of connect maybe some things that are going on in today's world with, the idea of how to evaluate partnerships, since Tripp has a big experience, long experience of actually working with and finding partners for nonprofits. So let's go into this company that you really were kind of very impressed with, which is called Bacardi. And let me So Bacardi joins in assisting hospitality workers with $3 million donation during COVID crisis. What impressed you about this, Tripp?
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple things that makes a lot of sense to look at this as the opportunity for us to see how people do deals. Right. I mean, because part of what you look at with Bacardi in particular, it's not enough that they were talking about giving $3 million to a specific industry or market space, but it's also how they retooled their company to meet the new needs with COVID-19. So they didn't just say, look, we're going to give you money and we're going to do some support. We're going to go for the public relations, but they actually changed how they do business and what they were doing specifically to meet the needs of the COVID-19 crisis. So I thought that was kind of interesting from the point of view of a pivot. As you said earlier, a pivot from a more traditional company to something else. And I think we see a lot of these kinds of things and opportunities out there. So it's a great opportunity to say, okay, what does Bacardi see in this opportunity? And what can we see as nonprofits that might be an opportunity to do this with another partner? I guess the other thought I have briefly would be, we always want to remember that this is very creative deal making. Part of what I would like you guys to start thinking a little bit more about this is, how do you put this together? So what struck you about this deal, Greg, from your perspective?
One of the things that really kind of struck me, which a lot of corporations are coming out and doing these assisting, is really if they have some money, where's the biggest need? And obviously the frontline workers are the ones that are in greatest need here. So, a $3 million donation worldwide probably will help somebody in some way that they can. But the other thing, we talked about earlier is also Bacardi also changed one of their factories, or started to make hand sanitizers, which makes sense. They make alcohol, why not make hand sanitizers, right?
Well, part of it I think is interesting is how quickly they could pivot. I mean, what you're talking about is a little bit more agility than you typically think of a big company. They are, I believe, the largest spirits maker on the planet. So when you look at that kind of number and you say, here's how quickly they were able to move into some new areas, specifically, this is kind of interesting when you start to say, how do we go about doing this? How do you as a nonprofit talk about some of these kinds of things? And also, the other part was it's a very targeted gift. I mean, if you look at it, it's not like for everyone. It's really about their community. And it's about the restaurants and the people who are selling and serving on the front lines, who are really the ones who really had to pay a big price when you look at it, because many of these restaurants are still doing a reasonable amount of business. However, their employees are making no tips or no money at all beyond the minimum wage, or maybe even not working, or maybe been laid off. So
right.
This is really an interesting way of going about supporting an industry that you're working in their case, for over 100 years.
Yeah, I think what's really kind of good about that is what they're doing is that they seem to be a company that thinks out of the box, even though, I think impressions that people have is that these old companies are not active, or they can't change, but this brand obviously, saw a need that, like, well, we're short on hand sanitizer. Let's take one of our factories and repurpose it, and let's make hand sanitizer, which obviously doesn't. I guess it's easy to make, because obviously they were able to pivot one of their factories in providing hand sanitizer. But I just thought that for a long old brand, it breaks the mold of what we think of, these stodgy, companies that are old. They don't know how to be agile, right? But obviously, here's a clear case in the other side, right, Tripp?
Well, yeah, I think the other part is they're being anticipatory of their market, right? So part of what
Mm.
they do is now, I think one of the other lessons I'd like people to learn about this partnership potentially and working with people is that this is the beginning, not the end. Because we're going to be through this for a number of years, probably, the repercussions of what's going on right now. So one of the things that I'd say to you is when you start thinking about people and what you want to do with those people, look at it, how it ties into your mission, vision, values. Clearly, Bacardi has a mission of serving people. And part of that is the organizations and their industry that they've worked through really does as well. And it's because they're a serving industry. And I think that's the other part that makes this interesting is how do you take in your mission and vision and values and put it into the market? And how do you share these kinds of stories and how do you make these kinds of things happen?
I got a question for you about that, because I think it's just that, like, I mean, if I was a social enterprise or even a nonprofit, and I wanted to approach a company like Bacardi, I mean, what kind of readiness do I need to do that before I even pick up the phone and just call them cold, right? I mean, and you talked a little bit about that, really trying to match mission and vision. Can you go a little bit into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think part of it is understanding your own mission and vision and values of your own organization first. Start with yourself in mind. Say, what do you think you want to do and what kinds of things do you want to be involved in? I've worked with a number of nonprofits that won't, for example, work with the tobacco industry for good reason. They're healthcare organizations. But you have to be clear about what this is and how do we go about it. And the other part of this is looking and saying, okay, how do I tell this story? Let's take that person on a journey, right? I mean, it's not just enough to say, hey, we're this kind of an organization and this is our mission and our vision. It really comes down to what's the journey look like and where are there some commonalities? Can we find those common touch points? And part of the precursor of a lot of the stuff we're talking about is understanding how they work. How does Bacardi work with nonprofits? So are they using a foundation like some of the different companies I work with? Or is it part of the regular company? Is it part of the marketing part under sponsorships? All these questions can be asked really quickly by just spending a little time doing some research on the company on the front end. And if you're let's say a mid-sized nonprofit, you can even go in and see who else they're doing work with, who else other gifts have they given over the last couple of years. They don't hide it. That's what's great about this is one of the weird things about partnering with a nonprofit is you have a lot more flexibility to find out people who've worked with them. You can even pick up a phone and call them. I had a nonprofit who wanted to work with somebody and they didn't know if they really wanted to work with them. So why don't you pick up a couple people? So I called up the people who are already working with them as a nonprofit and said, what's going on? Do you like working with these guys? You're looking at a nurturing process, not a hard start or stop. So part of your job is to, kind of put together a list of people you'd like to work with because they share the similar values that you do and the same kind of mission. So, I can think of a lot of companies that I've worked with over the years that have been very effective at putting their mission, vision, values, aligning them with the nonprofit I was working for, and coming up with a really rather creative solution for a lot of things.
So, I would do the thing that you would do, is look them up on the internet, just find out what they're doing, find out who they're working with, like you said. But a lot of the nonprofits don't do that, right? They just say, okay, well, here's a pocket we could probably pick. Let's just go and let's just go in there and see what happens. I see that all the time. Is that true?
Yeah, well, well, I think part of it though is because I think there's a style of how you do this, and I think fundraising in particular, there's a certain kind of person that gravitates to that kind of a style, and they're typically zealots and passionate about what they do. So
Sure.
ultimately, if you say to me, "Look, I want you to raise money for, in my case, the 500,000 kids in my system," it was easy for me to get fired up to go out and talk to people. But then I had to step back for a second and say, what does that person want from me? What can I provide them with that's going to give them credibility in their space that they're trying to do, or to build a brand? If you look at some of the great brands over the last several years, building these brands for younger women and self-confidence, it's not about the brand and the product. That's almost an afterthought with Dove. You look at him, if you have children, and you think to yourself, well, this is amazing. I can't believe this has helped my daughter. She's a whole different person.
And I believe this as well. I think why mission and vision and the values are so important ahead of time in your own organization, so that everyone speaks from the same voice, right?
Well, part of, yes, I think that speaking from the same voice is critical. I think it's also critical that the frontline people have the voice. Meaning, one of the funny things is I can go out and say I'm going out to, with the foundation CEO and having a conversation about working with together, and he'll give me the spiel, and it's really moves you because he's the founder of the nonprofit. He's been in it 40 years. It's his passion. It's everything about him. And then I stop by at the desk of the secretary on the way out the door and say, hey, I was wondering if I could get this, and she says, what did I look like? You know, and you've just blown a 2 hour meeting that really went well because your people on the front lines aren't committed to the same level of success as you are.
When I look at evaluating my mission and vision, when I'm in a nonprofit, sometimes you sometimes it also makes you reevaluate who you are, right? I mean, your personality of your organization and how the leadership thinks about what their real mission is. I mean, this is probably I mean, do you see people reevaluating this on an ongoing basis, or is this like something that, in your experience, you do it, maybe once every couple of years, depending on the changes in the environment or in the world or whatever?
Well, I think obviously we have an event right now that's changing everyone's direction, right? So now we look and say, how does that happen, and how long does that play out for? But I also think part of it is, I have a simple process. I call it the parade principle in nonprofits. And what that means is people come in at different times. So say I've got a booster club in football, and I have a group of people who are all involved for 4 years, because that's how long the kids go to school in that program. You're going to have lots of people come through that program over those 4 years, lots of new people coming in. It's a parade. The trick is, if you're the nonprofit leader, is you're helping and tapping into the people when they're ready to do it. So you might only get one good year out of that person, their son or daughter's senior year in that sport. But ultimately, how to make sure that when they're ready to work with you and really want to be more engaged, you're prepared to help them find a way of doing it. Difference. I think it's just, we need to teach more of the fact that it's seasonal. It's a very short period of time I have time to be involved in these things. Very few people have time to do it for day in, day out for many, many years. It's an exception, and we should honor those people as well. But the other part is, we need to understand, we need to be very willing to take charge of something when we have an opportunity.
Yeah. Okay. Well, talk about opportunities. Look at another partnership opportunity out here on the West Coast that happened just recently with our Governor Newsom. Let me share the screen for you. Sorry about that. And announces that Governor Gavin Newsom of California announces initiative to connect excess produce to food banks. And so in this is that what he wants to do, he knows that the farmers and ranchers have excess inventory. All the restaurants are not buying right now, and the suppliers don't have enough room to store all this excess. So why not give it to the actual food banks to who can give it to people who really need the food? And one thing that you and I were kind of talking offline was really, how this is really a great win-win because the government's involved, right?
Well, part of it, I think that's the question I'd say to you is, isn't it great that your government can do this? I mean, this is one of those things that the government can do much better than most people, which is put together partnerships at a high level. I mean, if you think about it, that's one of the benefits. I mean, I think I said to you, I don't think we'd see that here in the Midwest as much. That's part of the problem at times. I think it's a struggle at times that happens. But what impressed you about it? Because you're out there right now, you're seeing what's happening on the ground. What are you seeing happen in food banks right now for your area?
Oh, I mean, I think it's where you are as well. I mean, I think when a food bank opens in the morning, they already have a line of maybe 3 or 4 blocks of cars that's lined up to get into this, and then it splits up just like at Costco. It goes into the different lanes, and they have the boxes ready to go, and I think some of the needs that I hear from the food banks are not getting a balance of foods, right? Some people will donate, a lot of milk, or someone will donate a lot of diapers or something like that. But at the same time, they don't have the balance of the other food groups, right? And so, yeah, it made me think about when you were talking about earlier is actually finding out, like, if I was a food bank, how would I approach this program, right? Because maybe I have all my suppliers lined up for X, but what am I not getting in Y right now that I could maybe hook up with a farmer through this program? I mean, wouldn't that be kind of an interesting way to think about this?
Well, yeah, I think what you bring to the point is this creativity that has to come with it. I mean, part of it's born from responsibility of how to figure out how to take care of the people in your community. The other part of that is maybe there's some natural synergies that you can help put together between different kinds of organizations, because once you learn it, you can share it with other people, because there's always excess in this country, at least. Many times there's excess capacity, but it also brings up an interesting point about fundraising. I mean, one of the weird things I'm hearing from my food banks here in the Midwest in particular is there's an awful lot of food coming in right now. Everyone's bringing donations, and they're having a hard time running their CapEx budget, or they're having a hard time funding and paying for their building. They're having a hard time keeping heat on. These are things that I don't think we always think about. And one of the things that you can do with a partnership and a sponsorship is augment what you're doing with your normal effort. So when you look at what he's doing and you guys are doing to help people, can we augment that by bringing a different dimension, maybe the financial dimension, to the conversation? Because that's something we really need as well. I mean, this is not going to end tomorrow. People have been starving for hundreds of years. The problem is a lot of times they starve even though the food is in the market, but not in where they can get access to it.
Well, yeah, let me show you about this other article I found, which is really kind of highlights what you just said in terms of, needs in both places, right? Farmers are looking at a minus 50% demand, and then food banks are seeing a demand increase in 73%, due to the people who have been laid off and need food, right? Just worried about putting food on the table, and food banks are the ones that have that ability to do that. And just the fact that they're able to kind of, like you said, connect, have the government really step in and provide a policy to make that happen is just wonderful. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about, I've worked in I worked in nonprofits, I work with them quite a bit. I wanted to ask you about, like, one of the things I always hear about when it comes to some of these more strategic things that we're talking about in terms of partnerships is that, we're working so hard at the local level, including the executive director. We don't have time to do this, right? You hear that all the time, right?
Well, yeah, I think it comes down to management, right? I mean, one of the things that people don't, I don't know, I've heard of Peter Drucker, but he was a seminal management thinker in business. And one of the things that he did at his end of his life is he got tired of working with businesses. And so he decided to get involved in nonprofits. And what he discovered is that management mattered, right? I mean, this is his whole theory. And a lot of times we have directors that are very good fundraisers, are very good at the operational piece, but seldom are they cross-trained, right? So if you think about it kind of crazily, if you could provide some cross-training here to help people. And the other part of this is to give them the time they need sometimes. I mean, part of this is, if I know I have a logistics problem, maybe I go to a logistics company and make a partnership with them potentially to help support some of the kinds of things that need to happen, right? So we get creative in how we put the partnership. There's no limit of how many different ways you can structure some of these kinds of things if you have creativity and you give a little bit of collaboration. But typically what happens is, like you said, they're just overwhelmed with all the daily stuff. They miss the bigger picture. And the sad part of missing the bigger picture is typically because they're just like entrepreneurs. They micromanage their business, their operations, and their organizations. And a lot of times what they need is really somebody to help them train up on some of these kind of skills and capabilities that seem to be very tactical, but make a huge difference in how things happen and how the services are delivered to their community.
Yeah, I think intervention wise is I've worked on many nonprofits that, like, we almost had to kind of have an offsite. I mean, I always laugh at this because, like, two or three nonprofits I worked at, and I was on the board of a couple of them. To stop what we were doing, we had to have an offsite. I mean, completely leave the place that we're in and go to some neutral place. I mean, I think one of them we went like 50 miles outside of the county. I mean, just to get away from it all, but just to have some time to talk with one another. And therein lies the problem. I think is that, like you said earlier, they're not making it a priority, right?
Well, part of it also could be just how they're recruiting their own directors and people to their team. Part of what you have to say as your director's role is just as important to recruit people who bring complementary capabilities, so you can assign and work with them on other things, or they can work with it and bring it back to you finished. I mean, there's nothing wrong with delegation. I do a lot of work with actually between corporations and nonprofits, and it's called developmental delegation. And the whole idea behind it is I'm going to give somebody a responsibility, help them get the responsibility to develop them. And part of the review process at the end of it is how they learn to influence people. Because the one thing I think we always underestimate is the power of influence on this stuff.
Yeah, and again, going back to the mission, vision, and values, that should be pretty apparent in executing those. Right, is the training. Right,
Well, it's hard
so
to,
yeah,
isn't it hard you can't hold people accountable to what they don't know, right?
yeah,
So you have to have a clarity about what you're having them do. And part of that is to have them involved in the founding of those things. I mean, one of the weird things I do with non-partner profit partnerships is I actually try to put a mission, vision, value for the partnership, not for the nonprofit, not for the corporation, but let's draw something up together as a team charter, just like you do in team building a lot of times on special stuff. That's what I try to get them to do there, so they both have a skin in the game and what they're trying to accomplish.
no, I agree with that. I think that's a great technique because I think then the corporation is also part of the solution at that point, right?
Well, and they feel ownership. The other part is I always ask people who are busy to do the work, because I find that they're much better at delegation and they're much better at getting things. So a part of what I'm looking for when I'm looking for volunteers to be the bridge between the organizations is someone who's very effective. I don't want to train them on being effective. Now I will if they're younger, because I do think that the next generation has a whole different way of looking at nonprofits. And I think to be effective, they're going to have some of these things. And the other part is I think we're entering an age where uh, people don't have to stay with the same nonprofit. I mean, I know my mother was with a nonprofit for 22 years. uh, I don't know any of my relatives that are younger, that are women, that would stay with anything for 22 years when it comes to this, unless they were treated very well. And secondarily was developing some new skills and new relationships on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, it's hard, right? I mean, I think there's so many, especially in the economy. Well, before COVID-19, the economy was really doing well. So, you know, I think there was a lot of opportunity for a lot of different types of people, right? So I think that also plays into it, is that you're competing with the for-profits too, if you're a nonprofit or a social enterprise, right? For the same skill sets, right?
Well, I would almost go further than that. I would look beyond the short term of saying COVID-19, this is going to change things. Yes, it is. But a visionary or someone who's in a leadership role really has to look beyond that. And so part of that is educating and saying to the people here, I'm looking beyond this. I think people are actually experiencing burnout from COVID-19, from all the stuff they're exposed to. So I would tend to say to someone, look, your next generation of leaders want to be involved in nonprofits. This is a given, 88%. So 9 out of 10 times you say to somebody, do you want to be involved in a nonprofit with someone between the age of 30 and 45? The answer is yes. Well, that's a great pool to pull from. And vice versa, it's also a great place for the corporations to keep and have another benefit for their employees. Look, you can be involved. We'll match whatever you put in.
Okay, well, let's end this first part of the podcast on for partnerships. We'll have a multiple part series here. So in the future here, we're going to really talk about more of a deep dive into maybe creating the value in the stakeholders, like kind of like what you were saying, kind of creating this mission vision around the partnership as opposed to around the organization, which I thought is a really good technique. And talk about also communicating about how do you communicate with one another in this partnership, right? I think you're gonna kind of we'll have a conversation about that, and then what how do you sustain the partnership, right? Is it just this one project, but you want to go on multiple projects, right? So, which is talks about the commitment, right?
Well, it's interesting because I think it comes down to a couple of things. Communications and collaboration are critical, right? No matter what we're talking about. And that's an area that a lot of times people struggle with in these areas. So I'm very excited about sharing some of the things we've seen work in that area. and then couple it with this, keep saying to people, look, I'm going to keep beating the drum of creativity because I believe ultimately the creative nonprofit is what's going to survive. And some of them are going to turn into social services kind of organizations that are already there with 100-year histories. They're going to need to reinvent themselves. And part of that's to be able to provide them the tools they need to do that. That's part of why we're doing this right now, is to really provide practical tools, not just to, hey, this is nice to do, but let's give you some real meat that you can use for your own organization to get to where it needs to be.
Okay, well, we'll end the podcast there. My name is Greg Valeria, aka Social Greg on Twitter, for It's a Not About Me podcast with my partner. How do they get a hold of you, Tripp?
Sure. My name is, again, it's Tripp Braden, and you can reach me at Tripp Braden with two P's. The other thing I'd ask you to do today, if you really like today, this is our first direction. Let's make sure we sign up today. One of the things we're finding is once people find us, they're very excited about what we're talking about. So to do that, we're going to ask you to do some of the promotion for us. So just sign up there and register. So whenever anything comes out, you're the first person to have it. Sign up down there. The second thing I'd say to you is start sharing these stories with people and then helping them understand better what you can do, because I think there's a lot of good material here and we'd like to share it.
Great. All right. Take care, everyone. Be careful out there.